Mediastan is a road movie which follows WikiLeaks activists on a mission to reveal sensitive U.S. secrets. We're showing it throughout the day here on RT and can now discuss it live with a special panel of guests. We have the producer of Mediastan, Johannes Wahlstrom, joins us live from New York. Also, Afghan journalist Enayat Najafizada, who joins us from Kabul. And then finally, we have WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who's on the line from London. Thank you all for joining us. In Mediastan, journalists search for media outlets to publish leaked documents. Let's first take a look at a clip from the film, which gives viewers an idea of some of the reactions that you got.
От нас, от журналистов, пока не требуется такого жесткой критики.
Хотели бы все-таки с нашим главным редактором это вопрос согласовать. С Умедом Маханом.
Американская, может, из-за этого.
Ну да. А в принципе ведь Радио Свобода является, как бы сказать, финансируется ведь американским госдепом.
Конгрессом.
Конгрессом.
So Radio Free Europe, financed by the Congress. To say the least, some of the reactions were, we can't do this. Julian, is that what you expected, these kind of responses to WikiLeaks, to the WikiLeaks offering, I should say?
Well, we didn't know, and so this was really a test of the media environment throughout the Central Asian region and moving beyond to London and New York. That's what makes this documentary so interesting, is that we have different media organizations in different countries, but all starting out at the same place. Our journalists come to them, offer them the same type of material, US government diplomatic cables, and then we see what the response is. Publish, not publish, censor some things, and document their thinking as they're doing it. And in most cases, there are very significant constraints. In fact, most cases resulted in no publication by the organizations concerned at all. Others published some material and not others.
Johannes, what about you? Do you feel like the mission you documented in Mediastan was a success? There were a lot of reactions, I remember, in Tajikistan with people saying, you're not going to make a difference, nothing will really change.
I think that if we speak about making a difference, or if the mission in itself was a success, obviously in regard to actually getting the material published in the various medias, it's difficult to call it a great success, because there were actually not that many newspapers, neither in Central Asia or for that matter here in the United States, that were particularly interested in publishing the full material that they got access to. So from that respect, no, it wasn't a success. But from a broader respect, of course, we can see that the WikiLeaks releases have made a large impact, I can say, and they have changed the way that we interact with media since then. And I think that if we just look at the whole NSA affair, which has been going on for the last half a year or so, that is a direct consequence of the WikiLeaks releases, and that is the fact that that nowadays there is no direct censorship which is feasible by particular media organizations, but we have publications that happen in different countries and different places where it is possible for them to become published.
Right. We also have Afghan journalist Enayat Najafizada with us on the line from Kabul. He actually took the risk and decided to collaborate with WikiLeaks. In short, he said yes to their offering. Let's take a listen to what he had to say in the film about the risks.
Having access to this information would help me, as an Afghan journalist, to disclose the face of warlords, the face of those who committed crimes, the face of those who committed genocide. But later on, when I knew that having these materials could be dangerous, since Afghanistan is an insecure country and there is no guarantee for the life of a journalist.
Enayat, tell us, how did it turn out? Did you manage to publish any leaks? How did it turn out for you in the end?
Well, for some times we decided to take these diplomatic cables from WikiLeaks and work with some Afghan media organizations in Kabul and in many other provinces to work with some local organizations as well to publish, to make stories out of these cables. But unfortunately, later we found out that having these materials with ourselves might be life-threatening, and would be difficult for Afghan media organizations to make stories out of them.
I want to talk a little bit more about the actual channeling of these revelations, of the leaks, and your challenge. I mean, the film obviously proves how difficult it was across Central Asia, per se, but let's talk about the United States. Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, decided to blow the whistle on U.S. Army violations. He did so before going to WikiLeaks, and he was turned down by the media as well. Why do you think that happened, Julian?
Sadly, it's no surprise to me. I can't talk about the specific case, of course, but we've dealt with many others. You know, all media organizations that are any size get invited to sit at the table of power. And that's because they become powerful organizations in their own right, and people want to curry favor with them as an organization, with individuals in the organization. And so they eventually become part of the very family that they claim to be holding to account.
But another whistleblower, Edward Snowden, used the media and not WikiLeaks to channel his revelations. Don't you think that's a good sign that he was able to do it through the media?
Well, I think it's quite sad, actually. Edward Snowden didn't go to, in fact, the media. He went to someone that's closely associated with us, a specific journalist, Glenn Greenwald, and another specific journalist, Laura Poitras, who are the most prominently coupled journalists to WikiLeaks. Glenn Greenwald, for his part, was then working with The Guardian, has left The Guardian as a result, in part, of the censorship by The Guardian of that material. To date, less than 0.05% of the Snowden documents have been published.
The majority of the media are still reluctant to challenge the government, like you said. And speaking of Glenn Greenwald, recently he reprimanded journalists across the globe for not standing up to the government. Let's have a listen to what Glenn Greenwald had to say at a recent IT conference in Hamburg.
What it is that we were targeting is in the behavior of the media over the past 6 months as these revelations have emerged almost entirely without them and despite them. The role of the U.S. media and their British counterparts is to be voices for those with the greatest power and to protect their interests and serve them.
Johannes, I want to ask you, is it as bad as Greenwald is saying?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, if you just understand that powerful media institutions are part of power rather than being, so to speak, mediators of information. If you just understand that very idea, then obviously you will start looking at media and consumption of news or information in a different respect. So yes, of course, it is that bad. And if we look at an institution such as the Washington Post, which was one of the first institutions that had access to Snowden's NSA documents, they decided not to publish anything, and I mean practically didn't publish anything. And what we can understand from that is that there is a direct relationship between the different power institutions in our societies, and media is most definitely one of the most important power institutions that we have in our society.
Well, of course, the examples of Manning and Edward Snowden, your example, Julian, of course, showed us what revealing, the cost of revealing, I should say. As days go by, you still don't know your fate. Have you started having any regrets?
Not at all. Let's look at the shift in development over the past 3 or 4 years. The internet has gone from a politically apathetic space to a new international body politic, which is just starting to find its feet. Edward Snowden was motivated largely by Bradley Manning, both by the success of his revelations and by the ill treatment of him in prison, demonstrating that the US government lacks moral authority, and it is not possible to change the system from within. This very conversation is part of that process. So I am, to a degree, optimistic that there is a new international cultural consensus forming. It is largely embodied within the generation of young people between the age of 15 and 35, and it becomes to a war between an older generation and the large body of the younger generation. The older generation is simply going to lose. An important part of this process has been demonstrating that the old media organizations are simply a branch of the establishment power within their societies. It wouldn't come as any surprise that the US Army would not, say, publish US government diplomatic cables. That's no surprise. But we simply should also not be surprised that the New York Times censors material, or the Washington Post censors material, or the Guardian, or the Central Asian republics newspapers censor. They are power institutions, they have interests. What has gone on historically is that they have been very hypocritical institutions in pretending that they are always free to publish anything that is truthful and that the public is interested in. That is false, and that is the illusion that needs shattering. RT, many other organizations, they have a power interest. RT is naked about its power interest, being a Russian perspective. All media organizations are based somewhere within power, and we must see what their power interest is and not assume that there isn't one. The propaganda that there isn't one is simply false.
That's interesting that you say that. Here at RT, we certainly don't hide who we are, where we come from, and what we want to talk about. How deep does it go in the mainstream media? Because I certainly meet a lot of people over the years I've worked here that believe they're true journalists. They're doing the right thing. And obviously you're talking about some decisions that are made on the corporate level at very high levels. How far down does it go? Do these journalists that work for the mainstream media understand what's really happening?
Well, look, the best ones do. There's a lot of fine journalists working at the New York Times, Associated Press, and elsewhere, and they use their media institutions just like the rest of us use Shell in our car. They see that it is a network and a process, a distribution system, but they don't buy the rhetoric. It is simply a tool to be used to get out what they can, try and pass through the filters that they can. The problem is there is a sort of cultural blinkering that occurs over time for many of the people that are in that system for years and years, whereby they are simply not capable of recognizing the censorship that is occurring. That it goes on for so long, it becomes imbued into the subconscious. So they do not even have the thought of a story that might be censored by their editors. They're so experienced at not succeeding along particular directions, or being smacked down, or seeing other people disciplined or fired, that the very thoughts cease to occur to them.
Johannes, I want to ask you about the price, again, that whistleblowers have to pay. Edward Snowden also, like Julian, saying he has no regrets, but he became the most wanted man in the world, gave up his family, his job, still doesn't know his fate. How long are whistleblowers going to have to pay this kind of price?
Well, you see, if you think of the price that he pays, then compared to the actual impact that this price results in, then it's not a very high price, if we put it this way. And the reason why I'm saying this is that if you think of it, if you think of an occurrence as this, if it were to happen a few years ago, then Snowden would most likely be in prison, and we would most likely not even know of the existence of any of the NSA documents. So from that point of view, the price that he would have paid a few years ago would have been much, much higher compared to the impact that it would have resulted in. And today, I would say that considering the fact that the monopoly of information has become, has to a large extent shattered, because of this, the system of censorship that we can see inside the big media institutions such as the New York Times or Washington Post, or for that matter, any of the large Swedish newspapers, the country where I'm from, that these monopolies, they've become irrelevant. And we can see that in this particular example, where whistleblowers have the opportunity in getting their information out via the help of the internet or via the help of globalized media structures, such as RT for that matter, as an example. And I think that we're seeing a system where actually the ability for us to get access to this type of information is becoming much higher, and I think also that the price that we will have to be paying in the future will be much lower, which means that actually I see this from a very optimistic and positive viewpoint.
Enayat, in Afghanistan, obviously the risks are a whole different kind of risk there. Are you going to continue your work to try to keep revealing the truths?
I think this is our responsibility as journalists to reveal what's happening behind the scenes within the government, in the regional level, as well as international level. So I have been working as a journalist since 2006 in Afghanistan, and the risks to be a journalist in Afghanistan is so high. Since early 2013, there have been 60 cases against journalists, violence and many other cases against journalists in Afghanistan. So there is a high risk to be a journalist in Afghanistan, but this is our responsibility not to give up and continue our work as a journalist.
I want to talk a little bit about the state of press freedom in the UK, specifically the detention of David Miranda, the destruction of the Guardian hard drives. What are the British authorities so scared of? They say it's terrorism. What is it really, Julian?
It's lack of authority, what they're scared of. It's like most of these prosecutions. They're there to set examples, to make people scared, not in relation to a particular area, but in relation to the authority of the security services, the judiciary, broadly speaking, what is defined as the establishment in the United Kingdom. Because when people defy authority can't do what it wants to do in a whole range of areas. So the Guardian newspaper, very reluctantly, I might add, defied authority, the unwritten rules of the UK system by publishing quite a serious story about GCHQ intercepting hundreds of cables, hundreds of telecommunications cables coming into this country that pass information onto continental Europe. Now, in response, the security services obviously feel threatened, and the police and Whitehall all move to try and discipline the offender to show an example of what happens if you violate the unwritten rules. Now, let's look at this situation a bit more closely. What's happened in the UK is quite different to what has happened in the US. The US, for all its faults, is still a relatively analyzable society. It does have a constitution. Yes, there are lots of unwritten rules and very powerful organizations and a deep state of 16 different intelligence agencies. But in the UK, there's not even a constitution. The unwritten rules form a greater part of the body of the management of the United Kingdom. And so you see a very British reaction by the Guardian newspaper coming under pressure. It allows GCHQ technicians to come in and destroy its hard drives, and then keeps it all quiet. It keeps it secret, even though it's not legally compelled to do so, for over a month, and then made the reveal that had happened, even though they had footage of it, made the revelation in the 9th paragraph of a blog article by the editor in a film about me, to show that they weren't confronting directly the UK establishment. The Guardian didn't put that on its front page. It didn't splash the video up the next day, which it should have, by rights. This is
so what
the
we're
biggest
seeing
media story in the UK
you're saying
in
is that
almost a decade.
we're seeing
and yet it was hidden.
self-censorship is what you're saying we're seeing.
That's right. That's a classic example of self-censorship, that The Guardian suppressed it all until the David Miranda event happened, until they found that there was an event where they could latch on the fact that this had happened to them. Once they saw that there was a bit of outrage about David Miranda because of the Brazilians, David Miranda was a Brazilian, were concerned about what was happening. He's a homosexual, so the homosexual lobby was concerned about what is happening. He was simply a spouse of Glenn Greenwald, so those people who felt that there should be a barrier between work and family life, that was an effective lobby. So they simply injected the revelation that they had destroyed their own source material, that they had allowed intelligence agents into the Guardian office. They thought, well, now we can finally sneak it out. So that's an example of self-censorship, but there's been many others in the case of The Guardian and other organizations major media organizations that we've worked with.
2013, if anything, with Snowden's leaks, has basically told us that privacy is dead around the globe. Johannes, is it possible to revive it? Can we get our privacy back?
I mean, getting our privacy back is pretty much the same kind of question as can we get democracy back, or can we get freedom of information back? And in my point of view, this is a process that you have to strive for, particularly more or less every day. And in that respect, there are many different things that can be done, but the most important part is building public awareness about these issues. So if we speak in particularly about privacy, I think that many of us now that we know that that our emails are continuously read, or that our telephones are tapped, we can start thinking about different technical ways of solving this issue. But the most important first step is that we started to speak of it. And if we speak about, for example, freedom of information or sort of more broader democratic issues, then obviously the first step is to start discussing what are the limitations that we exist in, and how can we try and solve these problems. So Julian mentioned the self-censorship at The Guardian, and I think that this is actually a very important it's a very important topic that we should kind of try and see from a certain point of view. So, for example, this film which RT is showing that we have done, Mediastan. This film has been seen by hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and nonetheless, neither The Guardian or the New York Times, or for that matter, any other established mainstream Western media institution has written about it, has mentioned it, even though they are themselves in the film. So in order to address a problem, and the problem is, say, for example, self-censorship or control or relationship between media institutions and power, or if it's a question of our integrity and our ability to communicate freely without interception, the first obstacle that we must get over is the obstacle of actually speaking freely about these troubles. And the first thing we have to do then is to provoke a conversation. So how do we provoke a conversation? Hopefully, by having the conversation outside of the system, we can have it large enough, either to the extent that we make the established structures irrelevant, so that we just ignore them. If they ignore the conversation, if they ignore the NSA, if they ignore problems within freedom of speech, then we can ignore them and they become irrelevant. Either that, or our conversations will become part of the mainstream, will become part of this of the system, and by doing that.
But will it be enough? Will it be enough? That's the question. Because like you said, hundreds of thousands of people have seen this film, probably hundreds of thousands more will see Mediastan. But you have governments, you have neoconservative polls, and I want to ask Julian about this, in the US that show when people are asked whether or not they would mind surveillance if it protects them from terror attacks, they say no, they won't mind. How do you fight against that?
You can get any kind of answer you want on a poll. I'm not surprised to find that there was a majority of people in response to that question. If you place the question a different way, would you mind that you and your children are permanently recorded in all your email correspondence and Facebook communications and so on in order to extract economic information, political information, and terrorist information? I think you'll find the answer is probably no. So I don't find that particularly surprising. If we look forward to this broader question about where mass, or as they call it, strategic interception is going, it's not going to go away. There is no hope that it's going to go away. What's the nearest analog if we go back in history? Well, there's another strategic weapon, nuclear weapons. If we go back to the end of the Cold War, US, Russia, with nearly 10,000 nuclear weapons each, capable of destroying the world many times over, a large lobby that didn't like that, many movies showing about how bad it was, a very expensive system to maintain. No need for them to any significant degree after the Cold War. The US could have reduced its numbers down to 200 without any significant problem, and yet it still has 5,000-6,000 nuclear weapons. So these powers do not give up voluntarily any sort of significant ability to control the world like that, let alone one that is invisible, intangible, complex, and decreasing in cost by 50% every 18 months. And that's the case for the mass surveillance that is occurring around the world. It's not going to go away. The only thing that we can hope for is that we have increased ability to surveil the results, to make sure the results are not just going to one particular power faction. So it's not an information apartheid that has been generated. And the other is for new technology to develop, some of which is already around, used by us and some other specialists to protect the core of the opposition, if you like, to this NATO-based group, which controls now more than 80% of global military expenditure is in the hands of just one group. If it gets to the case that we have global surveillance and global military expenditure all in the hands of one group, then you can see what the result is going to be. We're going to have a very oppressive worldwide dystopia with maybe a few Chinese banks.
Julian, just briefly now, where do you draw the line? We saw a horrific terror attack in southern Russia today, 15 people dead. Perhaps if Russian officials were spying on their citizens, listening to phone conversations as much as other governments, it could have been prevented. Certainly people will argue that. Where do you draw the line between security and surveillance?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Of course, the situation there in Russia has causes. It has a situation in the Caucasus where you have men and women who end up in a situation where they have nothing to live for, where they think they can throw away their lives because their husbands have been killed in war, where the opposition has been fractured and is not unified, so there's no deal that can be done. So there's other ways of dealing with this situation as well as spying, but of course every country, properly stated, every truly independent country needs an intelligence service to make sure it stays that way. And there needs to be some kind of ability to monitor groups that engage in real not threats of violence, but actual violence. But I mean, that can be done with targeting. It's been shown as a result of these NSA disclosures that, in fact, the mass surveillance on the American population, to all the telephone records of every single American, has stopped precisely 0 terrorist attacks. So, as you might expect, it's much better off targeting specifically and with great intensity those people that you know making some kind of plot, and because the world is connected, feathering out into those they associate with and inspire.
Thank you all so much for taking part in our live panel discussion about Mediastan surveillance and other leaks. Julian Assange live from London, Johannes Wahlstrom live from New York, and Enayat Najafizada live from Kabul. Thank you so much for being with us.